Acting Deputy President, I think this is my third go at finishing a contribution on this bill, this very important bill, and hopefully I will see it through today. But just to recap, because I think it was last week the chamber last considered this bill. This bill is a very sensible change, a very reasonable change, a very moderate change to the requirements or the obligations placed on SBS, the restrictions placed on SBS when they undertake commercial advertising. We are making the incredible change from allowing SBS to advertise 5 minutes an hour for 120 minutes a day, or 120 minutes across the day, to now being allowed 10 minutes per hour, but still restricted to 120 minutes per day. So our proposal as a government is that SBS would not be allowed to advertise any more over a day, only that they would be allowed to advertise more within particular hours. Same amount over the day, but a more concentrated and focused advertising task in particular hours. And why is that important? Well, it's important because, of course, some hours of TV are better than others. Some hours of TV will provide SBS and broadcasters with an opportunity to raise more revenue than other hours. So by making this change, we allow SBS to make more efficient decisions about how they spread their advertising over the 24 hours a day. It's very important to remember and reflect that the commercial broadcasters are also restricted in how much advertising they can show per day by separate legislation, but by legislation, and they are restricted to 350 minutes per day. So we are still maintaining that difference, that SBS are not a commercial broadcaster and they will advertise much less over a day than the commercial broadcasters, even after this change comes in. So the commercial broadcasters are 350 minutes per day and SBS only 120 minutes per day. The commercial broadcasters can advertise between 14 to 16 minutes per hour. SBS, even if this bill does go through, only 10 minutes per hour. And I did, in my previous contributions, Mr Acting Deputy President, was critical of the Labor Party's stance on this bill, particularly their intransigence to want to clean up the mess that they created. It's a very moderate change. It's only going to raise something like $28.5 million over the from 2015-16. But it's still important. It's still important to maintain SBS's services, to allow them to continue to provide the product they do to all Australia. But the Labor Party opposed to that, even though that they put us in the position we're in. They put us in the position we're in that we have to find some efficiencies and savings, like any household would, after you borrowed $240 billion in 6 years. You borrowed $240 billion in 6 years, you've got to start cutting the cloth after those 6 years, and the Labor Party didn't want to do that. But I do want to give them some credit that they have supported the change to fuel indexation, because that is another change we needed to make, indeed a more substantial change we needed to make to get this country back on track. I just hope that if they could, rather than be inconsistent, but be consistent on these matters and say and be a partner in trying to get this country back on track by saying, OK, we agreed with fuel indexation, we agreed that that is now something that we have to face up to as a country, and if we don't, we won't have the money to pay for our roads in 10 to 20 years' time. Likewise, the Labor Party should reconsider and think about that if we don't make changes like this now, how are we going to continue to fund SBS over the next 10 to 20 years? It's not as big a funding task as the billions of dollars we need for roads, but it still needs to be funded in some way, shape or form. And they're not proposing more taxes. They're not proposing other funding streams for SBS. So how are they going to fund SBS's programs into the future? This is a reasonable change to take some pressure off the budget to allow that funding to occur, because I certainly want to see SBS continue. As I said in my earlier remarks, my mum is Italian. I grew up watching Italian news with her and her grandparents. I didn't understand a word of it, but I understand the importance of this broadcasting channel to help integrate the multicultural society we have and make people feel part of our community and part of Australia when they arrive here. We are very lucky to to have something like the SBS. I can't think of another example like SBS anywhere in the world where a publicly funded broadcaster is dedicated to providing services to ethnic communities all across the country. So the very fact that we are unique and we are able to fund this institution means that we must always be wary of making sure that we can continue to fund it, because clearly other countries have decided they can't afford to fund something like this. We have decided we should, and I agree with that decision, but it has to be funded. It has to be refunded responsibly. We need to allow them to manage their budget responsibly, and this would be an extraordinarily simple change which builds on the decades of history that SBS have of partly funding their services from their own source revenue, systems that have been in place for decades, that have been supported by both sides of politics. This is a very small and moderate change to those arrangements, which should be supported by this chamber.
Thank you, Senator.